So yes, I thank you for your welcome. Thank you for your invitation to come here and be in person in Hefei. It's interesting to be here after all these years. I've heard of the State Key Laboratory for Fire Science for many years, but this is my first visit to come here. So thank you for your welcome. Uh, as you Wang just said, my presentation is covering research done over the past decade and done largely by some of my students. So I'll be talking to you about some work that two of my master's students did a few years ago, Ian and Craig. Some work that PhD student Farian Wu, who graduated some years ago now, did, and my postdoc Augustine, all in the same connected world of under-ventilated compartment fires. So I'll start with giving my acknowledgements because sometimes you leave this to the end, but it's important to know where the ideas came from, where the funding came from. So the original project ideas go back to BRE about 10, maybe 12 years ago. They started doing some work in under-ventilated fires. Farian, when he came to study at the University of Edinburgh, was funded by the Ministry of Education of Taiwan. The three research projects that Augustine worked on were funded by the Fire Service Research and Training Trust, which is a charity, a fire research charity in the UK. And we've also collaborated with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and the London Fire Brigade. So coming to this from the fire brigade angle, the fire brigade want to know, when we've got a fire in a basement or a limited access space, how should we attempt to approach it without making things worse? Do we approach it from inside the building? Do we attack it from outside the building? These are the questions the fire brigade face on a regular basis. And certainly in the British context, in all our high streets in our city centres, you'll regularly see what we call ceiling lights on the pavement outside buildings, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there. Fire brigade guidelines say that in the event of a fire in a basement, the fire brigade are supposed to break those windows so they can access the downstairs. But fire brigade experience tells them that when they break those windows, bad things happen. And sometimes, unfortunately, people have died as the fire brigade have broken a window, introduced new ventilation into a fire scene, and you get a rapid flare-up, backdraft type event in an under-ventilated space. Similarly, when firefighters approach a room inside and there's evidence of smoke damage around the door, the question is, should we open the door? How can we open the door? So our project's largely based on science. We're looking at the science of what happens when you open doors to under-ventilated spaces, or at least that's part of it. So I want to, over the course of the next half hour or so, give an overview of what we've done, breaking it down into 5 parts. The first part should be simply an introduction, where I tell you things that hopefully those working in the field of fire science already know. Then I will tell you about our backdraft project. I'll then go on to talk about the peculiarities of when a compartment is only ventilated through a ceiling vent, how that differs from a standard or understanding of a compartment fire, and then finally talk a bit about firefighting in this context. So I do, at the outset, assume you know something about flammability limits. I assume you understand concepts of lean burning, stoichiometric burning, fuel-rich burning. I assume you know something about fire behaviour in the open air, about ignition, about fire growth, about how fire spread works. And I'm also going to assume you know something about fire behaviour, whether that's flashover or ventilation-controlled burning. But I'm also going to talk about other aspects of fires in compartments. Fires, things that you may have heard about before, such as what if the door is too small? So very inefficient flow of air into the space. What if the fire can't grow? How does the fire behave? So many of you, I hope, will have read my colleague Dougal Drysdale's book and will have seen this diagram that I've taken from Dougal's book. It's based on work done in the 1970s in Sweden. And very clearly you can see here we've got a plot of rate of burning inside a compartment versus ventilation factor, A root H, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And you can see that when the ventilation is very small, flashover cannot happen. There's a minimum ventilation size required before we can even have flashover. So when the doors are small, when the ventilation openings are small, flashover may not happen, even if there's a high fuel load, even if there's plenty of time. The restricted ventilation simply means that the heat cannot build to the level required to bring about flashover in a space. And these slides are slides that I use in my undergraduate teaching, where I like to talk about a fire in a compartment. That's where we have an object or objects on fire. They may be surrounded by a room or a compartment, but the compartment is not the thing that dominates the fire behavior. The fuel determines the fire dynamics, and the compartment is there, it's heating up, it's accumulating smoke, but it doesn't control the fire. The flames sit attached to the fuel package. When we transition to flashover, or transition to what I call a compartment fire, the compartment is the thing that determines the fire dynamics. The flames may now no longer be attached to the objects providing the fuel, but there still needs to be a heat exchange. There's a heat exchange from the flame to the object so that the object can release its fuel through pyrolysis into the room, and that will burn wherever there is a suitable mixture of air with the fuel. But here we have the situation where the compartment determines the fire dynamics. Now, if we take that picture and we reduce the size of the opening, well, what happens is the flames naturally move further away from where I've imagined the fuel source to be. That may break the feedback relationship. It may stop the radiation from the flames being able to produce the fuel. That would give you a problem. If you're the fire, it will give you a problem because the fire may not have the energy it needs to sustain itself, and so the fire dies back and gets smaller and produces less fuel. And when it does that, more air comes in and moves the flames towards the fire object, and the fire object gets more heat and starts to release more fuel, and it pushes the flames away, and we end up with this situation where the flames may move in the compartment and the fire may grow and shrink and grow and shrink as time goes on. And it really is the balance between where the air is and where the fuel is that determines where the flames exist, but this will not be a steady state situation. This will be a situation where the flames are moving, constantly moving. And I like to scare my students with a little bit of chemistry, because I find that students that study fire science are very good at heat transfer, they're very good at maths, and they're a little bit scared of chemistry. So I always put chemistry in just to remind them that there are complicated things happening. When we've got plenty of oxygen, burning behaves in one way. When we've got less oxygen, carbon monoxide is produced, and we will talk something about the role of carbon monoxide in compartment fires later on. But if we have a fire burning in a compartment and a door is closed, or it begins to run out of oxygen for whatever reason, the heat doesn't immediately vanish. The heat continues to remain after the fire may have gone out or got small. And so pyrolysis may continue when there is no flaming. And this is crucial when it comes to understanding what's going on. Just because there are no flames there or small flames there does not mean there is little fuel there. It usually means there is little oxygen there. This is a flammability diagram. I'm sure you've seen something similar before. The thing I like to remind people, you've quite often looked about this in terms of pre-mixed flames, and you look at where the flammable mixtures are. But essentially, if we're in a compartment fire, thinking of the sort of global equivalence ratio, we're burning somewhere in the middle of the mixture, but as air is consumed, we tend to go up towards the upper flammability limit. We tend to go towards that boundary of burning that we don't know very much about. When I look into the literature on flammability, it is well understood at the lower flammability limit. It is very poorly understood at the upper flammability limit. And indeed, when we've had a compartment fire burning for long enough, we approach the upper flammability conditions in a very unusual situation where we have the oxygen has been removed from the air, so we've got an enhanced nitrogen atmosphere. Again, something that's rarely studied with pre-mixed flames. It's very hard to do any kind of predictions. Anyway, that's my introduction. I would like to tell you a little bit about backdraft now. So I'll show you a clip from a Hollywood movie. There's a Hollywood movie called Backdraft, and this is what happens in that movie. The sound seems to be coming from my laptop speaker, so I'll point the microphone down. So that is the large explosion scene in the film Backdraft, and I would like to state, as a fire scientist, that what you just witnessed is not a backdraft. What we saw there was someone opened the door and immediately an explosion happened. That is not a backdraft. So let me explain what a backdraft is in case you're not familiar with it. Imagine we've had this green box on my screen as a compartment. A fire has been burning in that room, but it has limited access to the outside, limited ventilation, so the fire has consumed a lot of the oxygen. As the fire has died out, it has produced pyrolysis gas. It has released fuel into the atmosphere. Because a fire has been burning in this room, it is hot. So inside the room, we have all the gases from the compartment. The temperature is elevated. Oxygen levels approximately 12% or less, because above 12% burning would probably still happen. So we're probably less than 12%. According to most of the studies in backdraft, we need about 10% of the atmosphere to be fuel gas. So we've got pyrolysis gases in the atmosphere to about 10%. Meanwhile, outside this compartment, we have ambient air. It's probably 21% oxygen at ambient temperature, whatever that may be. And we imagine that the fire inside the compartment has died out or maybe transitioned to smouldering. There may be residual little fires, but it's not very big. And then someone opens a door. So what happens now, when the door is opened, we immediately get a flow because we've got a density difference between the gases inside the compartment and outside the compartment. The hot gases inside will probably be lighter than the cold gases outside, so they will tend to flow out the top of the opening. Meanwhile, the gases from outside begin to flow in the bottom of the opening. And this carries on. The outside gases form what we'll call a gravity current, or buoyancy layer, I guess, along the floor level. Meanwhile, the gases, the hot gases, are flowing out the top of the compartment door. And what inevitably happens when you've got two flows going across each other is you get turbulence. And when you get turbulence, you get mixing, and some of the air mixes with some of the hot gas, and we get a turbulent mixed cloud in the middle. So this will now be a mixture of gases, some fuel gases, some oxygen, a lot of nitrogen, at an intermediate temperature. So it won't be as hot as the compartment was, it won't be as cold as outside was, but there will be some oxygen and some fuel gas. And the question that I usually ask my students at this point is, will a flammable mixture be formed? And then when you stop and think of it, yes, of course a flammable mixture will be formed. And the more you think about it, you realize it's almost impossible for a flammable mixture not to be formed, because we've got a mixture above the upper flammability limit here and a mixture below the lower flammability limit here. When those two mix, they must somewhere form a mixture that is flammable. Now that may not lead to anything tragic happening. Sometimes, however, if there's residual hotspots, smouldering, ignition sources inside the compartment, you might get an ignition, or even if it's hot enough, you might get auto ignition. So we've got ignition inside a premixed cloud. So what immediately happens is you get a highly rapidly expanding, high temperature explosion driven out through the opening, because that's the only way that the pressure relief can go. So you get this explosion, this fireball coming out the door. So that's not what happened in the film Backdraft, because in the film Backdraft, as you saw, there was no time for this mixing to happen. So something else was going on there, but there was no time. This is what happens in the lab, in reality. So you saw the door being opened, time passes, and a backdraft. Now obviously this is lab scale. The box there is about 120 centimeters long, and when you see the backdraft, it takes some time to form, and the flames are about as long as the box was deep. So if you scale this up to the size of this lecture theatre, for example, if there was backdraft conditions in here and someone opened the door over there, the flames would go the whole way out into the corridor for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 meters. It looks dramatic enough when you look at it from side on, but I'd like to give you, I'll let it do once more, I'd like to give you the firefighter view. Because you open a door, you see nothing. Is it safe to enter that compartment? I can't see any fire. Looks okay. Oh. And scaled up, that is not just a little puff of flame that comes, it is a very violent fireball that comes in the direction of the people opening the door. So we did research on this, and essentially what we did was, for some of our experiments in the box, we just let the box grow from ambient to flashover conditions, and we had thermocouples inside the box, and these are at 4 different heights. So these are the top 3 thermocouples inside the box. We started with a tray full of polypropylene pellets with a bit of liquid accelerant. So what you see is the liquid accelerant, the heptane, gets the fire going fairly rapidly within 3 or 4 minutes, and then the liquid is mostly burned off. We then see a steady growth. Now the fire is already at its maximum extent, but what it's doing here is it's heating up the box. So it's losing energy to heat up the walls, the floor, the ceiling of the compartment. So the fire gains in heat release rate because it's losing less as time goes on. And then certainly in our experiments, when you get to about 12, 13 minutes, the fire grows fairly rapidly to flash over at about 13 or 14 minutes. Now, as I say, there were 4 thermocouples in there. The one nearer the floor is cooler, obviously, because that's where the cool air comes into the compartment. And when we reach flashover, it's still above 200 degrees. So in one of our experiments, at this point, we closed the door. And what we see when you close the door is obviously we cut off the air supply, and the fire goes out, and the temperatures begin to diminish. Actually, what was the cool temperature jumps up to join the other ones. So once we close the door, because there's motion of air in there, because it's a moving space, everything gets reasonably well mixed, and the temperature difference between the top of the box and the bottom of the box goes down to about 50 degrees. So everything is within 50 degrees in the compartment. Now, what we then did at some point in this process is we opened the door. And the questions are, what happens? Which of these points do I get a backdraft at if I open the door? And in fact, that's if we take the fire the whole way to flashover, but that's what happens at the flashover point. But what if I close the door before flashover? Would I get backdraft on one of these points? What if I go to many different door opening times, many different temperatures? Where does backdraft happen? Where does it not happen? Essentially, at the start of our project, what we had was an unknown territory. We needed to map this territory out and see where in this space does backdraft happen and where does it not. And we found a few interesting things. In experiments with polypropylene fuel, we found that there was this zone where you don't need to have flashover in advance. The temperature simply needs to be above about 400 degrees, 450 maybe. Close the door, let the gases accumulate. So long as the temperature doesn't drop below about 350 degrees, anytime you open the door, a backdraft occurs. Now, I say this was when we did the experiments with polypropylene, and when we did the experiments with polyethylene, that line was slightly lower. It was about 30 degrees lower, but exactly the same pattern happened. My student Farian has gone on to do some work with timber, and again has found a slightly lower number for timber, which is now published. You can find it in Fire Safety Journal. And you will see, but there is a sort of cutoff temperature. But if the compartment is above 350, when we know the fuel, always backdraft happens. And then we found slightly below that, if there was a pilot source, if there was a pilot spark in the box, there was a zone below that down to about 320 degrees where we got backdraft with a pilot flame. So above 350, it's auto ignition. It just happens automatically because the compartment is hot enough. Below 350, but above 320, and when the compartment has been hot enough for long enough, so it's tending towards the right-hand side of the graph, we get a backdraft with a pilot flame. There was also a zone that we describe as reignition, because the fire restarts, but in a less explosive way. And that comes down actually down to 200 and something degrees. And again, it kind of sits below there, but this is not a violent explosive event. This is not something that firefighters necessarily need to be particularly worried about. So if we could define the boundary between these two, we might be able to save lives of firefighters. And then below that, there was a zone where we never saw reignition or backdraft. As I say, the same pattern occurs with different fuels, but this is the details for polypropylene. I hope to have a project sometime soon that looks at this in more detail when you've got mixtures of fuels, and hopefully we can generalize a bit more as to safe conditions and unsafe conditions. Farian, in his research, also did a lot of gas analysis, and we looked at what was going on with the mixture in the compartment, in the conditions that led to backdraft, and the conditions that didn't. And you can see here in the graph, again, above 350 degrees, we have this zone of non-piloted backdraft. But actually, on occasions when the door had not been closed for very long, even if it was hot, we didn't see ignition. And this has been correlated in this graph against the carbon monoxide concentration in the compartment. So actually, it appears that you need a minimum concentration of carbon monoxide. Certainly when we're below 350, in the zone where backdraft was observed, the carbon monoxide concentration was always above 2.7, 2.8 percentage. Now, I've spoken to professional firefighters in the UK, and professional firefighters in the UK attribute everything in terms of underventilated burning to the role of carbon monoxide. They will tell you when you see what they call angel's fingers in the smoke layer, that's the carbon monoxide burning there. I don't believe it is. Firefighters talk about carbon monoxide because carbon monoxide is the thing they can measure. They don't have a device that measures pyrolysis content in the air. They do have a device that measures carbon monoxide. So when they observe things, they correlate it with the one piece of information they have. I don't believe that 2.8% of carbon monoxide gives us a backdraft. But 2.8% of carbon monoxide is an indicator of the duration of underventilated burning. It tells us when the flames have been extinguished and the fire has been, and the room has been hot enough for long enough to generate the minimum quantity of pyrolysis gas that is not measured on this graph, which is necessary for backdraft. So while carbon monoxide measurements can be done, please don't attribute the behaviour to the carbon monoxide, because I don't believe that's the case. Another interesting thing we found, and this was known before, but we characterized it a bit better, is the relationship between the door opening size and the delay. So you saw in the experiment, Farian opened the door, there was a delay of 20 seconds or so, and then the fireball happened. Now, if the door was smaller, the delay is even longer. And you can see a graph here of the delay time of backdraft versus the opening size. When the opening size is small, the delay time, even in our small box, when our small box is big enough that I can almost lift it myself, or small enough that I can lift it myself, we were seeing delay times of up to 60 seconds. Now this scales up. So actually, in a full-size compartment, you may see in Farian's experiment a 10-second delay. In a full-size compartment, that may be a 30 second, a minute, 2 minutes, even longer delay. I mean, 60-second delay in the box, that corresponds in some full-size situations to maybe 5 minutes. This is a very worrying thing for firefighters, because they open the door, they look in, they see nothing, and how long How long do they have to wait before something bad happens? So what we know is that in a larger compartment, there's a longer delay time. Smaller opening, longer delay time. The longer the compartment was sealed for, the longer the delay time. The cooler the compartment, the longer the delay time. Now, in the experiments we've done so far, we cannot decouple those two. We can't distinguish longer delay time, the duration of closure, from compartment temperature, because they were both, compartment temperature dropped with delay time. So we need to do some more experiments to figure that out, to decouple them. And at the moment, I'm not sure firefighters can use this information, but hopefully, as we do more research, this will become a practical thing that firefighters can actually work with. I mean, even in our experiments here, you can see in the yellow graph there, the time of door closure plotted against delay time. There was a minimum. We never saw a delay of less than 2.5 seconds. We never saw what you saw in the film Backdraft. The door opened within a second, big explosion. That never happened even at the small scale. That suggests that at big scale, at real scale, you've always got a period of time. And we think this is probably a period of time that you can use to analyze gases to make decisions if you've got the appropriate kit. But anyway, I've talked enough about backdraft. I want to move on to some of the other things. Our research didn't use methane. Methane was the primary fuel in most of the literature in backdraft. We deliberately used other fuels because methane is readily ignitable at room temperature, whereas pyrolysis gases are not. So let me tell you about ceiling vented fire dynamics. This is, you're familiar with what a compartment fire looks like when the opening is on the side. This is a small flashover demo from our lab, and you can see the fire grows. The little pieces of wood in there ignite when we reach flashover. We start to get flames out the door, and everything in here is correlated to this opening factor, which is the area of the vent times the height of the vent, A root H. Now what happens when we turn the compartment round so the opening is on the top? The area of the opening does not change. But how do I define root H? Well, I can't, because H, there's no hydrostatic difference across the opening. So we have a very different situation. And this is some work that was done largely by two of my master's students a few years ago. They were replicating at small scales some experiments that had been done at full scale by Chitty and Fraser Mitchell. Those have been published, but they're very hard to find. They only did 4 experiments at large scale. We did a lot more at small scale. The primary aim was to characterize the different modes of burning. Our apparatus looks something like this. We've got a wooden crib inside a box on a load cell. The opening is in the top. We can change the size of the opening. The compartment looks something like this in design and something like that in real life. And as you can see, there's multiple panels on the roof that we can open to create different sizes of opening. We were expecting one of 4 kinds of behavior, really. Pulsing mode, which is what I described earlier. It's where, because the opening is small and because it doesn't have a clear buoyancy-driven ventilation path, what happens is at some points when the fire is large, it's expelling hot air, which means that cold air can't get in through the opening, or hot gas is going out. Then the fire gets starved, it shrinks back. As it shrinks back, it allows cool air to come in, which then provides ventilation for the fire so the fire can grow, and you get an oscillation. You get the fire growing big, small, and that repeats. We've also heard of ghosting mode, so that's where you can see the flames kind of detaching themselves from the object and just moving around the compartment, going wherever oxygen can be found. In some situations, we expected an asymmetric mode when there's any asymmetry in the arrangement of the fuel or the opening. Then we might get a situation where you get hot gases on one side of the compartment, one side of the opening, and cool gases on the other side. And also something that was observed at full scale was actually the flames migrated to the opening and sat in the opening, behaving very much like a pool fire. Even though the flames were detached from the fuel, there was obviously enough radiation coming from the flames to continue pyrolysis of the fuel. So there was a distance in between them, but that fire sat quite happily because it gets its oxygen from outside, its fuel from inside, and there was enough radiation to sustain the burning. This project, we were looking at fully involved compartment fire behaviour. We did not concern ourselves with how the fire can grow to those conditions. In fact, we cheated. We used a side ventilated opening to take the compartment to flashover conditions and then changed the doors. That was largely due to an earlier project. We had tried one project earlier trying to grow fires in reduced ventilation compartments to kind of flashover-like conditions, and it was very hard, so we cheated this time. You will see in the pictures there were bidirectional probes in the opening. Data from those was not great, and actually they got in the way of the flow pattern, so I will not attempt to present any of those results. We did also try to take heat flux measurements in the compartment, which I will not present here because they're a bit complicated. And we also had the calorimeter hood above estimating heat release rate. And what we will observe is that the changes in the burning modes do not appear to change very obviously in correlation with the heat release rate, which was interesting. So this is a sort of typical experiment. It's unfortunately a handheld video, but you can see the fire burning in the box, and then the fire goes out. The student gets slightly worried and he moves away. You see some white smoke coming out of the compartment. The student standing well back just in case something happens. And of course, because I knew I was going to be presenting this, I picked one where something did happen. So we saw quite a big flame coming out of the opening and then reignition inside the box. We did 21 tests that were well instrumented, a few where we were just playing around and trying to get the feel of it. Varying the number of vent openings, varying the size of the crib, varying the position of the crib, and looking for the different behaviors, the pulsing behavior, the ghosting behavior, the asymmetric behavior, and the pull fire behavior. So here is some of our typical data. This was test number 17, which was basically our default case. The central two vents were open, so it was more or less a square opening in the middle of the box with a standard crib directly under it, 32 sticks of wood. And what you can see here is the temperatures. We allowed the fire to grow to flashover in 200 and something seconds, and then changed the ventilation conditions, after which it went to a ghosting behavior. Then it extinguished. You can see the temperature dropping. There were six different heights of thermocouples in the box, so you can see eight actually in that experiment. 8 different heights of thermocouples in the box, and you can see the heat release rate as measured by the hood at the bottom there. There was a period of white smoke and no apparent flaming, and then it reignited, went to ghosting, and then eventually burned out. When we have a larger opening, we see a slightly different pattern. There was a steady burning for a while. Then as the fire grew, it grew through a pulsing phase and then went to ghosting where the temperatures were higher. So the temperatures above 500 up to 600 degrees, and then that burned out. When we have only a single vent, the ventilation is very restricted. Temperature dropped. It was very, very messy behaviour in this test. There was some pulsing, there was some smoking, there was some ghosting, all happening in quick succession. And then the fire burned out. And then in one of the cases where we observed the pool fire mode, this had a larger crib, so there was more fuel there. What we see was some pulsing, and then it went to a steady pool fire mode, and then eventually that went to ghosting and burned out. So what did we observe? Well, we observed that when the temperature in the compartment was below 500 degrees, there were no steady burning observed at any point. Pulsing behaviour observed sometimes, and sometimes, and we're not exactly clear why sometimes and not others, when the fire pulsed, the temperature went up, and sometimes when the fire pulsed, the temperature went down. And we've not figured out why pulsing has two different modes. But we never observed pulsing for extended periods, except in that very restricted ventilation case. It was pulsing and doing weird stuff, but the fire was really struggling in that one. Most of the time when pulsing was observed, it was only for 30 seconds, up to a minute maybe, and then it transitioned to something else. When the temperature was above 500 degrees and there was a high fuel loading, we saw the pool fire behaviour. So when it's hot enough, the fire can migrate to the opening and it can just establish there. But when there's too much of a distance between the opening and the fuel, or there's less fuel, at high temperatures we see the ghosting mode where the flames drift around inside the box. And you get sort of gentle, it looks like slow combustion because everything seems to slow down. You just watch these gently moving flames. So I'll show you a video of some of these. So this is the ghosting mode. This is actually not very easy to see, particularly in the screen here. It might be easier when you're watching online, I don't know. This is a fire that extinguished, and then we saw smoking. So when we saw lots of smoke, that was an indication that the fire was out, not necessarily an indication that the fire was out permanently, because they reignite like that. Here's what the pool fire mode looked like. So the flames are significant. They appear to sit just inside the box and extend outwards. And that was sustained for several minutes in our conditions. And then in the case where the fuel load was off to one side, we saw asymmetric behaviour, so the cool air going in at one side and coming out the other side. And sometimes in the one, particularly in the one opening, you saw flame, you saw white smoke, and then that varies. You're back to white smoke, and then I think it goes back to flaming again in a moment. Yeah, the white smoke's kind of diminishing, and then you get a little flame, and that just repeats. So that's ceiling vented. The final thing I want to talk about is firefighting under ventilated fires. What did the fire brigade do? So in the UK at least, I don't know what your current practice is here in China, but the firefighters are approaching inside a building to a closed door. What they will do is they will check the temperature of the door. They will spray water outside the door in case there's a flammable atmosphere above the door opening, to make sure that everything is okay in the corridor. They open the door slightly and they look inside. Now we saw what that looks like in the backdraft box. You look inside, what can you see? Well, with your eyes you can't see much. With a thermal imaging camera you can see a bit more, but I don't think they've got the information to make a good decision as to whether to proceed or not. So what they generally do is they spray a pulse or a few pulses of water into the compartment, close the door, wait a bit, repeat, a few more pulses through the door, bit of observation, and they repeat until the officer in charge decides it's safe to enter. At the moment, how do we know how to do that? Well, the officer has experience. Hopefully that's enough. But sometimes, unfortunately, we still get it wrong and firefighters enter unsafe spaces. So we did a bit of experiment. We had this compartment that was separated in two rooms. We've got one room with a fire in it, one room that we designated the smoke room, so that's kind of the approach room to the fire, if you like. There were a variety of doors, two doors on the sides, one on the top, one vent on the top. And we established a baseline fuel configuration where it didn't really matter what door or vent you opened, we got some flare-up or backdraft when you opened it. So here is, it's not the greatest video, but you can see opening the ceiling vent only, and again, like backdraft, after a period of time, you get a backdraft like event venting through the top. This is the same viewed from the other side. Oh no, it's actually a different test, but it's that one went much faster. That was only 7 seconds. So we found that, oh actually I think I've ended that video too soon, because there should be, yes, there should be that one when you see the opening, the side vent. Oh no, I'm not going to the right one, sorry. Yes, that was the bit I was looking for. This is the side vent only, and you see quite a significant backdraft event through this after some time. And again, the length of the flame was comparable to the depth of the compartment. So we had a few questions. What if you open two doors? What if you can introduce water spray in there? And what if you introduce water spray without even opening a door? So that was spread across 3 projects. What we found that if you open 2 vents, things were always better. So that's 2 vents open, a ceiling vent and a side vent. Yes, there was a little flare up there, but it was a lot less violent than the backdraft event. So we started looking at water spray. I won't read out the words on that screen there. And let the fire grow, introduce water spray into the compartment, looking at the temperature measurements, how the water influenced the temperature. And the most interesting thing, I think, is that we varied the way of introducing the water. So on this graph here, zone A, zone B, and zone C, you can see in each of those zones there are 4 spikes downwards, and that corresponds to 4 times when we introduced water spray into the compartment. In each case, the temperature was, we were aiming for approximately the same temperature, so it was about 280 or 270 degrees. In zone A, we introduce a 2-second pulse of water spray, the temperature drops. We let the temperature grow back up to the same because the fire was not extinguished. We let the temperature go up to the same temperature again, and introduced the same amount of water, but in two 1-second pulses. So instead of a 2-second pulse, it was two 1-second pulses. And what you can notice is that the second peak drop is bigger than the first peak. And when we go to, we let it grow back to the same temperature, did a 3-second pulse, temperature drops. Let it grow back up again. 3 1-second pulses, temperature drops more. Now the red line is the temperature in the upper layer in the compartment, the lower line is the temperature in the lower layer of the compartment. And you can see actually the variation of temperature in the upper layer is different depending on how we introduce the water, whereas the temperature in the lower layer doesn't care how we introduce the water. The temperature variations are about the same. So actually what we can see very clearly here is that introducing water in pulses cools the upper layer more efficiently than introducing water in a continuous stream for the same amount of water. So it's more effective at cooling the upper layer, which is of course where we want to cool. The lower layer is less important. And again, if I zoom in on that, you can see the same amount of water, but a dramatically different cooling effect. You can see there the second peak in both cases is much more significant than the first peak. Now, we did all our experiments at small scale, but we were able to extrapolate to full scale in terms of how much water you need to introduce in pulses to reduce the temperature of the upper layer. So if we're wanting to reduce the temperature of the upper layer by about 50 degrees, then at full scale, I now forget the size of compartment, it was our example, but you need to introduce about 6 litres of water into that size of compartment, into the upper layer in pulses to reduce the temperature by 50 degrees. Why is it important? Well, we found that reducing the temperature to below 200 degrees was what you needed to do for safety. If the temperature was at 250 degrees, if you can decrease it to by 50, it becomes safe. If it's obviously 350 degrees, you need more cooling. We're still working with Scottish Fire and Rescue Service trying to improve their operational guidance, and we still have more questions. But one thing the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service want to know about is the use of this thing. This is an ultra high pressure lance. This is a cutting extinguishing system, as it's sometimes referred to. This is a means of fighting a fire without even entering the fire compartment, because the lance, as well as water, if you flick a switch, you get little silica, it's like sand, in the water spray at very, very, very high pressure, ultra high pressure, in fact, which is sufficient to cut through brick, stone, metal. I've seen them cut through a wall that was that thick in about 30 seconds, and it just drills a hole that size and then injects water spray through. So you're injecting water spray into a compartment without introducing air. So this is one of the dreams, I guess, of firefighters. But if you're doing this from outside the compartment, you don't know where the fire is. How do you know if this is going to be effective? Because if you don't really know where the fire is, how do you know if it works for firefighting? So again, in our compartment, we tested multiple entry points at different angles. We injected water into the fire room. We injected water into the smoke room in such a way that it wasn't going anywhere near the fire. We injected it into the smoke room directed towards the fire. We introduced it from the ceiling down to the floor in the smoke room. And what we found was that the water spray worked for all those positions. It didn't matter because the water spray was a water mist system, very small droplets, ultra high pressure will give you very, very small droplets. It acts as a flooding agent. So it fills the whole space, even if you're not pointing at the fire. It cools the whole space, even if you're not pointing in the fire. But, as with before, the effectiveness is entirely dependent on the compartment temperature. The hotter the temperature, the more spray you need to put in, obviously. And we found, I said 200 degrees, I actually meant to say 180 degrees. Once you were below 180 degrees, everything was okay. But we also found that this didn't always put the fire out. So you still need to get the firefighters in there to put the fire out. So our conclusions from the firefighting projects, if you have to ventilate and can use a cross-flow ventilation strategy, so opening ventilations on both sides of the fire, that is well worth doing and improves conditions considerably. If you need to enter a compartment, use spray pulses to cool the upper layer to below 180 degrees. And you can use a cutting extinguishing system even if you don't know where the fire is, but you do need to know how hot the compartment is before you enter. And our conclusion for the fire brigade is always you can fight fires using knowledge as well as water. Some of this work is ongoing. I haven't done much on this for the past few years, but I'm hoping next year to get a master's student to work on doing the modelling part of the ceiling ventilated fires project. I did actually have a master's student a few years ago do that. Didn't work very well, so I'm trying again. The delay time of backdraft, I think, is our greatest asset here. There is every time you open a compartment fire door, there is always a delay before backdraft occurs. I think we can use that, and I've got a research proposal in the works at the moment to try and take that work forward, to try and work out how we can use that delay time most effectively for firefighting purposes. We're still talking to the fire brigades regarding the operational guidance, and I still think we need to know more about burning near the upper flammability limit of everything, because that would help us understand some of these things a lot better. Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, I will be happy to take them. And I gave all my acknowledgements at the start, so this is Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. That's me there, although it's hard to tell, and that's me there as well. And if you have any students who'd like to come to Edinburgh, we offer a 12-month MSc program in Fire Engineering Science, which of course your students are all very welcome to come and study in Edinburgh. Thank you.